Today's is August 15th, 2012, and we're interviewing at the Hyatt Regency Maui. Today we're here to interview Judge Michael Daly Hawkins in a brief video oral history to record some reflections on his career in the law. I'm Don Gaffney, and I'm here on behalf of the Ninth Judicial Circuit Historical Society. This interview will be preserved in the NJCHS archives, and the Historical Society will provide you with a copy for your own use. And with that, we'd like to have a discussion about your career in the law and your career as a judge. And I'll start with the easy stuff. You've been a judge and a practitioner in Arizona. I think you may be from Arizona, aren't you?
Yeah, in fact, Phyllis and I, my wife of 47 years, and I grew up in Winslow, Arizona, the town that Jackson Browne and the Eagles made famous. And there is a corner. And there was a girl, she wasn't in a flatbed Ford, but I married her. So yeah, we grew up in Arizona. She came to Arizona when she was about 18 months old, so that classifies, I think, as a native. But I was born in Winslow and went through the public schools there. And
how'd your family end up in Winslow? It's not a very logical place for most folks.
My dad came out from East Texas during the Depression with the Civilian Conservation Corps. And he worked on building hiking trails and fish hatcheries above the Mogollon Rim. And when he finished that, he came down as a standard oil and gas station manager. And that's where he met my mom. He checked the oil and washed the window and winked at her or something, and they headed off. And his first assignment after he finished training, they gave him a station in Winslow. Phyllis's father was the town doctor. He delivered my sister, and he was my doctor. And this typical small town. Everybody knows everybody, and their business.
Where's the Daly name come from?
That's my grandmother's name, and she came into my life at a difficult time with my parents, and she was a teacher. In fact, she was teaching in Arizona when it became a state. And she was born in Cordes Junction. My mother was born in Douglas. So our youngest son is a fourth generation native. And I spent a lot of time with her, and she was responsible for getting me back online when I was offline, and was a terrific classics teacher. She taught Latin and English at Chandler High School for many years. Eddie Basha was one of her students. He still remembers her fondly. And I always said to myself that if I ever had the opportunity to do it, I'd use three names. There was another reason. There was that I found out when I was going through the vetting process for the job. There was another Michael D. Hawkins in Phoenix, who apparently had been married about 9 times and had girlfriends and creditors. And to distinguish from him, I used all three names. So I just kept it.
Works both ways.
Yeah.
I assume Chandler back in those days was pretty agricultural.
It was. And she had Ray Hare. I don't know if you remember Ray Hare when he was on the Court of Appeals. Yes. A very fine judge. She was one of his students, and she had a knack for recognizing excellence in people and encouraging it.
Did you get exposed to the classics at that time?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, we read Cicero in Latin and Caesar in Latin, and until she died, we used to correspond in Latin. I can't even say hello in Latin anymore. But it was an interesting upbringing, helped me a lot.
Did you go directly from Winslow High to the high school up there into college?
Yeah, I left the day after high school graduation and entered summer school and at ASU, and that's the grandmother I just spoke of was the first editor of the state press. She graduated in 1908. Our son Adam graduated in 2006. I tried to get him to delay it for 2 years, so he would be exactly 100 years after her, but it didn't quite work out. So I was destined to go there. Then they opened the law school, and by pure happenstance, the law school, it was kitty corner from her house for many years in Tempe. After she retired from teaching, it was at McAllister and Orange. Now they're just walkways. But enjoyed Willard Pedrick I was in the first class with Mike Gallagher and Joe Sims and people like that, and Tim Burke, and great time.
What'd you major in? College?
In college, political science, cocktail conversation. If I had to do it all over again, I think I'd do humanities, but it seemed right.
And did you know, when did you decide you were going to law school? What'd you
I'd
do?
always wanted to be a lawyer. Television came to Winslow late, like in 58, 59, and one of the first programs I saw was Perry Mason, and of course it was all fiction. But that and an event that involved one of Arizona's first women lawyers, Amelia Lewis. I watched her stop the Winslow City Council in its tracks when I knew they wanted to do something, and just by uttering a few words, she stopped them and made them sort of examine what they were doing, and I thought, wow, if a lawyer can do that, that's something.
Yeah.
So, enjoyed law school, and I had signed up. The draft was gone in those days, was on, and graduate deferments except for medical school were in play. And I'd signed up for the Marine Corps PLC program as an undergraduate, and they called me in the last semester of my senior year in college and said, we're really short on lawyers. We noticed you're pre-law. Would you be willing to go on to law school and then come on active duty after that? And this is right during the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. It was a terrible time for the people over there, and I said, sure. They offered to pay for it. I said no, because that would have added to my commitment. Went on active duty and went through boot camp and basic training and got assigned to the East Coast, and at that time the Marines were coming out of Vietnam, so I was not in country. But we tried a lot of courts-martial where the events occurred in country, and I was stationed at Camp Lejeune for the better part of 3 years, and then came home.
Where'd you do basic?
Like all officers at Quantico, basic school, which then was called the Platoon Leaders Course, which is the same, it's just boot camp for officers, and then 21 weeks of basic school. I did the PLC between my first and second year of law school, and then came on active duty and did basic school.
Was your first case as a lawyer in the military courts?
Yeah.
Do you remember?
Oh yeah. In the last year I was a special courts-martial military judge. There's general court-martials are basically felonies. Special court-martials are basically misdemeanors. I think the longest you could sentence a Marine to was 6 months confinement, 6 months suspension of pay, and a bad conduct discharge. General court-martial could people in jail for a long time.
Yeah. Aside from your opening case, did you have any that were particularly difficult or challenging?
I have a lot of interesting cases. I prosecuted, I don't know if you remember the 1972 Democratic Convention. There was a guy who had been AWOL for like the better part of 5 or 6 years, tried to turn himself into George McGovern on the floor of the convention. Well, it turned out he had gone AWOL, or UA as we called it, unauthorized absence, from Camp Lejeune where I was stationed, so I prosecuted that case. And, he was defended by a really good private lawyer named Robinson Everett, who later became a judge on the Court of Appeals for the Armed Services. Quite a guy, and he did a terrific job. Put me through my paces.
Now, did you like, what in the military court system, did you enjoy being a lawyer, or did you enjoy being a judge more?
I liked them both. I was a fan of the system. As an outside observer, I've never understood why that system was not used for terrorists, because to me it was a very fair system, and although the juries are members of the military, I thought they bent over backwards to be fair to people. I thought that I would lose a lot of traction from being away from the practice of law in Arizona for 3 years, but we were using the federal rules of evidence. I was very familiar with them. By the time I came back to Arizona, they had been modeled into the Arizona rules of evidence, and I was over the fear factor. I had tried cases involving murder and that sort of thing, and the only adjustment I had to get used to was calling a judge Your Honor instead of Sir.
Were you already married by the time you were?
Yeah, Phyllis and I were married between the junior and senior year in college. You couldn't live together in those, and literally you couldn't live together in those days. An apartment owner would not rent an apartment to you if you were not married. You're probably too young to remember that.
I'm 38 years, so I do.
And so we got married, and I think it's 47 years this summer, 46 years this summer.
Right. So she ended up on base, and
She was on base. She loved it. It was like, 25 cents an hour for babysitting and 5 golf courses and the officers club, and there was raging inflation going on outside the base, and everything was price controlled within the base, shopping at the PX, that sort of thing. I really enjoyed the Marine Corps. The training was tough. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but it's one of the best things I've ever done.
where'd you get your discharge, or get discharged?
At Camp Lejeune.
Okay.
Phyllis had gone home a little early, and I drove the car back across the country, and after saying hello to my mother, my father died when I was in college, but after saying hello to my mother, she said, "You need to go see your grandmother. She's in bad shape." So she was living in Prescott at the time, so I drove up and saw her, and she died about a month later.
And then, so you and Phyllis ended up returning to Phoenix?
To Phoenix, that's right. And I started practicing law with Don Doughton, and over time, he and I were together almost uninterrupted with firms with different names, et cetera, for the next 20 years.
Now, Don started with another firm and then gone with you, didn't he?
He started a firm with Alan Feinstein and Guy Wilson, and that was the firm that I joined when I first got out of the Marine Corps. And yeah.
How'd you get hold of him? How'd you get the position?
I wrote letters to, I didn't know any better, and Phyllis didn't know any better at that time. I just wrote letters to a number of firms and came out and did some interviews, and I guess he liked me, and I certainly liked him. So, and it's been a lifelong association that I've really benefited from.
So, after starting practice for a little while, you had a detour into public service.
I did.
Really quickly.
I did. I got involved in 1976 with Dennis DeConcini's campaign for U.S. Senate. I liked him a lot, and he'd been a prosecutor down in Pima County, and I'd known his family, and particularly his mother was a great friend. He won, and President Carter won the election, and he asked me if I wanted to be U.S. Attorney, and I know when to say yes. So I went over and did it. I did it for 4 years, loved it, loved every minute of it. Great people in that office. We had 40 lawyers in those days. I think now they're north of 250. 40 lawyers, 19 of them have become judges. 8 of them federal judges. So it was a good office.
Were you in the old federal building there on First Avenue? Or?
Yeah. The one that one of my mother's cousins, who's a cotton farmer until his death out on the west side, told me at one time had hitching posts in front of it. So when people rode into town, they could hitch up their horses.
Did federal prosecutors in Arizona get a wide variety of cases? Were there any that took you stick in your mind during your tenure?
There were several. I thought maybe the most interesting was the Purolator truck robbery, where 2 people masquerading as highway patrol officers, right down to the light bar and everything, pulled a Purolator, like a Brinks truck, over, tasered the drivers, put them in canvas bags that they had pre-measured. They had scoped these guys out, took pictures of them so these, if you will, body bags fit them, loaded the bags down with coins and dumped them in Lake Mead alive. We charged them with bank robbery and murder in connection with a bank robbery, which is a federal offense. Met with the defense attorneys and told them that if they'd pleaded guilty and agreed to life without parole, that I would get agreements from any state prosecutor. And It could have been prosecuted in Yavapai County, Clark County, Nevada, because it went into Lake Mead, and they turned me down. So we dismissed the murder charge. Mike Scott and Mort Sitver tried the bank robbery charge. They were convicted and given 80 years, I think. And then the state took over the prosecution on the murder charge. But a fascinating case. I still remember the names of the two drivers, Cecil Dempsey and Russell Newkirk, and met their families, and horrible crime.
Mm. And during that time period in the late 70s, there were a lot of civil cases arising also with the Native Americans. And
Yeah, there were a lot of, we did a lot of prosecutions. We are, Arizona, and states are different in terms of the relationship of their criminal law to the federal system. In Arizona, the U.S. attorney is, in effect, the county attorney for Native Americans. If a serious felony that occurs in Indian country isn't prosecuted by the U.S. attorney, it doesn't get prosecuted. That's not true in California. And they're hard cases. They're hard to prove and interesting. It's a completely different culture, not unusual in, for example, an assault case for the two families to meet together and agree to conciliate and exchange sheep or cattle, and then come in and say, we don't want you to prosecute this case, we've resolved it in a tribal way. So it was really interesting stuff.
Now, following your tenure as U.S. Attorney, you returned to civil practice.
I did.
And was that a difficult transition or easy? Or?
One part of it was hard, and that was switching sides in criminal cases. You get imbued with the prosecutorial spirit, and it's a little hard to make that shift. But I ultimately did, and toward the end of my practice career was when the savings and loans were failing, and there was a premium on being able to do both civil litigation defense and criminal defense. And I think I was involved in most of the major S&Ls that failed at that time.
Quite a number during that time period.
I think every single one of every major S&L in Arizona failed.
Yeah. Were there any particular that you found memorable in terms of?
Well, I represented Gary Driggs, who was the CEO of Western Savings, and if you've met Gary, and I suspect you have.
I represented Gary.
He's a very interesting chap. Yes. We still keep in contact, but quite a personality.
Yeah. That was quite a transition also in Arizona on it. Did you find it stressful just working as a lawyer during that time period?
It was tough, and as you know, a lot of law firms got sued, and there was kind of a take no prisoner attitude on behalf of the lawyers that represented the Resolution Trust Corporation, who were assigned the job to come in and clean it up, and they were very tough on lawyers and very, very tough on people who represented lawyers, and there was tugs and strains at that time. But I think everybody came through it all right.
Yeah. Well, how long had you been thinking about going on the bench? When did it first start going through your head?
I had no particular ambitions to being a judge. I loved being a lawyer. I loved practicing law. I got good cases. I worked with good people. But Senator DeConcini called me up toward the end of his third term and told me he was not going to run for a fourth term, and that he had had a meeting with President Clinton, and the president asked him, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And he said, "Yes, you can put my friend Mike Hawkins on the Ninth Circuit." And he said, "I hope that was okay for me to do that." And I said, "Yes." So this was another day in time in terms of confirmations. I was nominated in July and had a hearing in August and was confirmed in September on a unanimous voice vote, and just as smooth as it could be. Senator McCain could not have been nicer to me. Told everybody, all the Republicans on the Judiciary Committee, that this appointment was fine with him, and so it was just sailed through.
Do you remember your interview?
Oh, yeah.
process?
Oh, yeah, yeah. And the one thing I remember about it was that they have these people at the Justice Department who prepare you for the confirmation hearing, and they've got examples of questions and answers and good ones and bad ones. And they said, the one thing is, you're free to talk with the press afterwards, but please don't say that your hearing was a breeze. So, had the hearing. Dianne Feinstein of California presided in it, 45 minutes or so. And then my brother came with me. Phyllis was back home, and we literally scooted out the back door, talked to no one. The headline on the B section of the Arizona Republic the next day said, "Hearings a breeze for Hawkins." And they called me up, "Did you talk to that reporter?" No, I did not talk to that reporter. Compared to what people have gone through in the last 10, 12, 15 years. I've got colleagues on the Ninth Circuit that waited 3 and 4 years to go through the process and stuff.
Well, of course, the vacancies continue.
Although we're in pretty good shape now. We have 28 active judges of the 29 positions. And, when I came on the court, I was the 18th judge. We were down 10 judges. Mm-hmm. And those first 3 years, we worked hard to keep the backlog at least at level. It was tough.
Well, obviously, appellate court's very different than sitting as a judge in military court system. Did you have a big adjustment to make, or was it small?
I was surprised by one thing, and I would never have anticipated that. You practice law, a client brings you a case, you dive into the case, you know the upside and downside of the case, and typically you're appearing in front of a judge, and your job is to persuade the judge that your client's position is closer to the law and the case law than your opponent. Well, that's exactly what you do as an appellate judge, except it's one of your colleagues. Mm. And I think lawyers who come from private practice have a distinct advantage in being appellate judges, as opposed to those that kind of come where their experience has mostly been being a trial judge.
Do you think that there's any issues in the system over what some critics have called sort of the cultivation of a separate judicial system than law schools and a path to judgeship?
I think that you put your finger on one of the huge problems, and I'm surprised it does not bother the business community more. When I came on the bench, 60% of Article III judges, put aside the Supreme Court, but Court of Appeals and District Court judges, were coming from private practice. They were people who had represented folks who had had the government pressing on them, other sides pressing on them, where their liberty might be at stake. And if they represented someone in business, they necessarily understood the business. That's not true anymore. And only in those days, only about 30% of judges were coming straight from, say, government service, prosecution, trial court to the appellate court, that kind of path, which is more of a civil service path. And I think that's a problem for the system. I really do.
I speculate, in fact, I've had the conversation with her as to whether or not Sandra Day O'Connor today could ever get through, having come from a legislator.
Yeah, it's interesting. During the 2008 primary, the Republicans had a debate at the Ronald Reagan Library in Simi Valley, California, and whoever was doing the question, I think it's John King, they just published Ronald Reagan's diary. He kept a diary every day, I think, from the time he was governor until the end of his second term as president. And on the day of that debate, he opened it up and read it, and the note said, "Today I nominated Sandra Day O'Connor to be the first woman justice on the U.S. Supreme Court, and I think she's going to be a great judge." And they asked everyone, including John McCain and Romney and the other people at that time running, if they would have appointed her, and they all said no, which,
No.
I'm sorry.
Well, if you're in legislature nowadays, you've got too much of a track record
That's right.
on it. Well, do you remember your first day on the bench?
I can remember the first day I was not on the bench, and it was to date the best oral argument I've ever heard. Let me see if I can do it in a nutshell. There was a criminal case tried in Phoenix in district court, and the jury told the judge, sent a note to the judge they were ready to come in and and deliver the verdict. And the clerk watched them come in and counted them and went 11, 12, 13. One of the alternates had sat in during juries, when the jury was deliberating. And at that time, there was a split in the circuits. A couple of circuits said, when that happens, you presume prejudice, you declare a mistrial, you have another trial. Another couple of circuits had said, no, what you do is you examine each of the juries individually outside the hearing of the others under oath and find out if the presence of that person in the jury room had any impact. So that's the case. So the case comes up on appeal, and about a week before it was to be heard by a panel where Mary Schroeder was the presiding judge, she calls me up. Had been sworn in at this time. She said, why don't you come up to San Francisco, put on a robe, sit on the bench, you can watch the arguments, you can go back in at conference and watch us conference the case, and you'll get a little bit of feel of what the case is like. So it's the second case on the docket. And the lawyer, the appellant representing the defendant, gets up and makes a perfectly good argument on why you should presume prejudice. And the lawyer for the government gets up, as a matter of fact, he's here at the conference, Rory Little. He gets up and he looks around the room and he says, I want to be the first to welcome Judge Hawkins to the Ninth Circuit. And just as none of us should presume that his presence in the conference room will prejudice your deliberations, you shouldn't presume that the presence of this alternate juror. Well, game, set, and match. It was one of the most incredibly good, on-your-feet, instant judges. The lawyers didn't know what's going on. They walk in the courtroom, and instead of 3 judges up there, there's 4. To date, it's still the best oral argument I've ever heard.
That's a good turn of the event.
Yeah.
Whichever way you put it. Have there been any particular memorable cases that in terms of decisions?
Well, I was on the Prop 8 case, which is now on cert to the Supreme Court involving same-sex marriage in California. I had a number of the terrorism cases involving FISA warrants and that sort of thing, and the suit against the Boeing subcontractor who allegedly was doing the rendition flights during the early days after 9/11, and reviewing top secret documents inside a room with 2 FBI agents outside, that sort of thing. Interesting stuff, but to me they all have a human side to them. Even Social Security and immigration cases have a very human side to them, and they all involve somebody's life. I think the other thing that I noticed was that I kept waiting for that magical lawyer from Los Angeles or San Francisco or Seattle or Portland, that after I heard the argument I would say, wow, we don't have anybody like that in Phoenix. I want to tell you something, that never happened. I never saw a Phil Von Amen or a John P. Frank or anyone like that. The good lawyers in Phoenix and in Arizona are as good as any lawyers anywhere.
That kind of you to say. And I mean, the Prop 8 certainly had sort of an all-star cast.
It did.
In terms of the
It did. Great lawyers on both sides, great briefing, great writing, 300 amicus briefs, some of them from some of the brightest stars in academia, and just a really interesting question at the onset whether what happened in that case is the proposition passed narrowly, and it changed the law and said marriage shall only be between one man and one woman. The then governor, Schwarzenegger, and the then Attorney General, Jerry Brown, refused to defend the proposition. So the proponents came in, and there was a big question about whether the proponents had Article 3 standing to, in effect, stand in and defend it. So we certified that question to the California Supreme Court, and they said yes. It's an interesting constitutional question for this reason. In the structure of initiatives, including constitutional amendments, the governor has no veto. So if you say that by not defending the proposition, no one else can stand up for it, you're in effect giving the governor a veto, which the governor doesn't have. And that's what the California Supreme Court relied on.
It's an interesting twist in California.
It is.
As you know, Arizona was held out of the Union for some time by Taft
Yes.
because our issue on referendum.
Yeah, our issue on
Judicial.
recall of judges, yeah, which they took out, and then as soon as they became a state, they put it back in, and it's been used once.
Well, in terms of working with your colleagues on the bench, obviously you've done some role as a judge back in the military court system, but were there any particular judges that you enjoyed working with, or you looked to as models, or?
We have some terrific judges on the Ninth Circuit. Margaret McCune is a great friend. Carlos Bea is a great friend. We have people, stars out of academia like Willie Fletcher and Marcia Berzon. I think it's a terrific group of people. I like them all. And by our numbers, when you rotate calendars, you don't see people for a while. And there's some truth to the notion that absence makes the heart grow fonder, and familiarity can breed contempt. So I had a friend who was on the Arizona Supreme Court, and he was miserable because he knew exactly, he sat with the same people all the time, over and over again. He could write their opinions for them, even if he disagreed with them. A larger court, I think, is more flexible in that regard. I think of all of the judges on the Ninth Circuit that I've had contact with, I just love Jim Browning. I thought he was absolutely fabulous. I'd been a judge for about a week, and I called his chambers, and the assistant answers, and I said, I've got a quick question for Judge Browning. So she connects me, picks up the phone, and he said, the answer is yes. And I said, well, you haven't heard the question yet. He said, I don't care what the question is. And afterwards, it occurred to me how brilliant that was, because it was showing that he embraced me as a colleague, but also there was some restraint on what I would ask. I couldn't say, can I have $1 million? And I had a pretty perfunctory question, but I'll never forget that. And he was such a smiling countenance on the bench. You know, we're right in the middle of the Tenderloin, the Browning Courthouse at 7th and Mission, lots of homeless people. He always talked to them. Every day he would walk from the courthouse to the Olympic Club to swim at lunchtime, and he would talk to these people on the street. And I walked with him one time, and they would say, here comes the judge. He's such a sweet man. Yeah. We really miss him.
Yeah. Well, both of you came from small western towns.
That's right. Bolt, Montana, and is smaller than Winslow, so, yeah.
It's kind of hard to get smaller than Winslow, at least during some parts of the year. Have all of your hearings been either in Phoenix or in San Francisco, or have you moved around?
Well, we don't regularly sit in Phoenix. Every once in a while we'll do an M-Bank, or sometimes we'll have a panel there if we have a big load of Arizona and Nevada cases. Years ago, when Judge Browning was creating internal administrative units within the Ninth Circuit for the purposes of assigning cases, somehow the lawyers in Phoenix convinced Mary Schroeder and Ozell Trask, who was on the bench at that time, that the lawyers loved to come to San Francisco and argue, and they weren't particularly fond of going to LA, and they didn't like the idea of arguing in Phoenix. They liked the idea of a trip to. So Arizona, Nevada, Eastern California, Sacramento, and Northern California and Hawaii are in what's called the Middle Administrative Unit, and by design, almost all Arizona cases get argued in San Francisco. In fact, I walked into the Courthouse Cafe one time, year and a half ago, and there you were, having a cup of coffee, getting ready to argue a case.
Yes, I did. In fact, my partner Joel Hoxie.
That's right, you were both there.
That same day, and we did not know we were in town. We did not know we had arguments.
In front of separate panels.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
In fact, I made him pay for the cab out of there. We both won, interesting enough. I'm sure that wouldn't happen again. 2 for 2. Well, was that much of a disruption to have to be up in San Francisco with family?
No. Phyllis and I bought an apartment up there in 1999, and we've had it since. And I try to compact hearings and screening panels and motions panels and the other administrative duties into the summer, so that I'm in San Francisco in the summer and Phoenix in the winter and spring.
Yeah, wise policy. Was it a big change to go on senior status?
No, it wasn't. I was happy to do it. I looked very carefully and watched my colleagues, those who went senior as soon as they could, and those who delayed it for a long period of time. And it seemed to me that the former group, the ones that did it as soon as basically they could, had a higher quality of life than those who didn't. And that's certainly been my experience. I've now had the chance to sit with the 10th Circuit in Denver and the 1st Circuit in Boston last week. Phyllis and I do a fair amount of traveling. I'm now doing some teaching, and I feel like this is the greatest retirement system in the world. I can work when I want and not work when I want.
Well, I do have to ask, how did you end up in Charlottesville to get a degree?
They had a program at that time they took 30 appellate judges a year over a 3-year period of time, and you were in residence in the summer for 6 or 8 weeks, 2 different summers, and then you wrote a thesis. And I thought that some of the best judges in Arizona, including John Roll, Noel Fidel, Bob Corcoran, Duke Cameron, some of the judges I really admired for not just their positions on particular issues, but their depth of knowledge about the system. And the other thing that I liked about the program is it brought me up to date on issues that had bubbled up since I was in law school. We didn't have environmental law school when I went to law school, probably when you didn't. You probably didn't have it. And I can remember going in the library, the law library, and if you found the Amjur on employment law, on the spine it said master and servant. And that's changed dramatically. So it offered an opportunity to catch up and also to put your nose a little bit into academics, and I enjoyed every minute of it.
What'd you write your thesis on?
I wrote my thesis, the title of it was John Quincy Adams and the Atlantic Maritime Slave Trade, you have to have a colon in a law review article, the politics of slavery and the slavery of politics. Really interesting guy. Kept a diary from the time he was 11 years old until the time he died, and then had 2 grandsons, both of whom were widely acknowledged and well-regarded historians who annotated his. And it's in 11 volumes. I own a set, and just a fascinating guy.
One of the great American thinkers, in my opinion. I think, as I recollect, he ended up being ambassador to Russia. Like
he was ambassador
22 or something.
He was ambassador to Russia
23.
in 1810, and there was a vacancy on the Supreme Court, and it was President Monroe nominated him for the U.S. Supreme Court. In those days, they would write it out in pencil, send it over to the Senate. They unanimously confirmed an hour after they got the note from the president. So in the diplomatic mailbag came not only the offer to nominate him, but he had the job. All he had to do was get on a ship and come home. And he refused it. He wrote in his diary, he said, I'm a politician. I don't like to arbitrate issues. I want to fight for the side that I think is right. I think the other thing is he really wanted to be president. And he became president. He was a 1-term president. But very interesting guy.
Wow. Is there something you'd like to talk about?
I think you've pretty exhaustively covered the subject.
I do want to bring up one, which is, at least in our state, is very important. You have done a lot for veterans in our state, and I'd like you to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I've on 2 fronts. One is I work with an organization that was started by my colleague Harry Pragerson in California called the U.S. Veterans Initiative, and we provide homeless shelter and job training, etc., for military veterans who are homeless. We have 2 units in Phoenix. One has 76, I think, as of last week under roof near 7th Street and Broadway, and another one we bought a hotel near Grand Avenue and Indian School, and that has 170 in it. And I've been very interested in that issue, and I've also worked on establishing veterans courts within the court system, both in Maricopa County and with Judge Silver's help in the federal court system, where military veterans are treated a little bit differently. And of course, they have access and have earned the right to services that people who have not served don't have.
Well, on behalf of Arizona, we thank you very much, and we appreciate it coming in today.
It was fun to do, Don.